Holding on to human dignity. Why poverty isn't just about the money. Poverty is defined as the inability to meet one's basic needs and capabilities because of a lack of economic resources. This often leads to an inadequate quality of life. The best way to measure poverty is with a version of the supplemental poverty measure that both accounts for capabilities and is individualized to each person's needs. Poverty cannot solely be defined as a lack of money. As John Iceland stated, poverty should be thought of in terms of exclusion from standards of living generally available to others in the same society. This means that poverty cannot just be looked at in terms of a universal set of numbers, but also whether or not someone is able to fit into society and meet its standards. As John Iceland stated, social exclusion can be defined as a shorthand term for what can happen when people or areas suffer from a combination of linked problems, such as unemployment, poor skills, low income, poor housing, high crime environment, bad health, and family breakdown. This social exclusion should be considered as well, because not being able to meet society's standards often leads to a lack of human dignity. As John Iceland stated, to be poor was to lack what was needed to be a credible member of society. Poverty should also be looked at in terms of capabilities. In the words of Nussbaum, capabilities are defined as substantial freedoms, a set of opportunities to choose and to act. It is vital to consider these choices, or lack thereof, when considering one's status, because like Nussbaum said, options are freedoms, and freedom has intrinsic value. Having capabilities leads to having opportunities. For example, when one gets an education, he then has a better chance of getting a job. Without these capabilities and this freedom, one can suffer a serious loss of human dignity. Let's look at an example. Take Bob and Liz. Bob is a single dad with 2 kids in Pascagoula, Mississippi, while Liz is a single mom with 2 kids in New York City, New York. Both Bob and Liz make $20,500 annually, which is above the official poverty threshold of $20,160. That being said, neither Bob nor Liz are considered to be in poverty, but their financial situations are still very different. Although Bob and Liz make the same income, Liz is working 55 hours a week, while Bob is only working 43 hours. Liz is paying $2,000 more in living expenses, as well as 122% more than Bob for childcare in relation to the national average. Liz also pays 106% more in taxes compared to the national average than Bob does. On top of all of that, Liz's son Dave has diabetes, which makes her medical expenses about 2.3 times higher than the average, which is about what Bob is paying. With all of these things considered, Liz barely has enough money to get by, even with an above threshold income. Bob, on the other hand, still has sufficient funds for all necessities. As Amartya Sen said, the adequacy of the economic means cannot be judged independently of the actual possibilities of converting incomes and resources into capabilities and functions. That being said, poverty is not just about income, which is seen clearly through Liz. Just like Bob, Liz has an income that is not considered low, but it is still inadequate. Out of food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, Liz can really only pay shelter and utilities, which is her cost of living. She cannot afford adequate nutrition for herself or her children, nor can she afford new clothes for herself or her children. Amartya Sen once stated that a poverty line that ignores individual characteristics altogether cannot do justice to our real concerns underlying poverty. Capability failure because of inadequate economic means. The official poverty measure is a poverty line that ignores many individual characteristics. Because of this, it is not an accurate measure of poverty. The official poverty measure excludes many things that are important when considering poverty. Among these are taxes, non-discretionary costs such as transportation, medical costs, and childcare, and geographic location. Other problems with the official poverty measure is the outdated poverty threshold of food times 3 and the use of just the immediate family as a basic unit. A much better alternative to the official poverty measure is a version of the supplemental poverty measure. In the words of Kathleen Short, The supplemental poverty measure is designed to provide information on aggregate levels of economic need at a national level or within large subpopulations or areas, providing further understanding of economic conditions and trends. The supplemental poverty measure is a much more better option for many reasons. The first of these is that it is a much more individualized measure. It does not rely on just a universal set of numbers and thresholds, but instead looks at each person individually. Secondly, it has a much more accurate threshold measure of 33% FCSU times 1.2. Lastly, and arguably most importantly, the supplemental poverty measure takes into account many of the things that affect one's situation that the official poverty measure leaves out. These things include geographic location, taxes, non-discretionary costs, and everyone living in the household. So why do these things need to be accounted for? Geographic location, first of all, affects almost all expenses. Cost of living, childcare expenses, and cost of food are just a few of the expenses that vary from place to place. That being said, the same amount of money may be enough for different amounts of expenses in different places. $1,000 may cover all of one's expenses in one place, but only half of one's expenses in another place. Taxes are also important, as they take out a large chunk of a person's income. If you just look at one pre-tax income, like the official poverty measure does, you are not getting a real picture of their economic situation. People often lose thousands of dollars in income tax, making their economic resources much lower than the official poverty measure gives them credit for. Non-discretionary costs also need to be accounted for. Just like geographic location, non-discretionary costs affect everything differently. Because of this, the same income for one person may barely or not at all cover their expenses, even though it is enough for someone else with different expenses. Lastly, everyone living in the household needs to be accounted for, regardless of whether or not they are legally related to someone. Iceland stated that the rapid growth in the number of cohabiting couples and people living in the non-traditional housing arrangements has magnified the effect of this issue. When we only account for immediate family living in the household, we often leave out many of the expenses a family is paying, especially when the growth of non-traditional housing arrangements. People are often only getting credit for a fraction of the expenses they are paying. A man may be paying the expenses for himself and his daughter, as well as his girlfriend and her 2 kids, while only getting credit from the official poverty measure for himself and his daughter, 2/5 of the expenses he's really paying. As you can see, the supplemental poverty measure provides a much more in-depth, individualized look into each person's situation, compared with the overly generalized official poverty measure. Because of this, it provides a much more accurate measure of each person's poverty. All of that being said, the supplemental poverty measure is still not perfect. As Nussbaum stated, a focus on dignity will dictate policy choices that protect and support agency, rather than choices that infantilize people and treat them as passive recipients of benefit. Because of this, an ideal version of the supplemental poverty measure would also account for capabilities. It is incredibly important to account for one's capabilities, as they play a large role in their status as a person and in their dignity. Capabilities are also very important because, when they come from economic resources, they aid in sustaining a quality life. By also accounting for capabilities, this version of the supplemental poverty measure would cover both the money and resources sides of poverty, as well as the dignity side of poverty, which are both vital to defining and measuring poverty. So how would this version work? Whether you believe measuring capabilities is up to the government or more private institutions, it is important to address capabilities on a personal level. One way to measure capabilities is to create a set of basic capabilities and have thresholds for each of them. With this set, you could examine how each person compares to the thresholds. Some of these thresholds could assess things such as education, nutritional options, safety, etc. By doing this, each person's individual issues with meeting their capabilities can be addressed. Through this version of the SPM, the full weight of poverty for every individual can finally be grasped.